light should you die to?
Everyone, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, where we're going to be here in just a moment. We've been working through this book of Ecclesiastes and sharing various wisdom principles, I guess you might say, as it relates to the things that the writer shares with us. We're in kind of this interesting text where he's going to kind of talk to us about how we deal with authority figures and how we should react to them. We talked Wednesday night a little bit in our study as we introduced the chapter that different time period, right? And time period in which they had basically kings ruled over every nation round about them. That was the system of government that was basically prevalent just about every nation in and around there. And so he addresses that. It may be hard for us to kind of make application of that in some ways, but we'll do the best we can to kind of understand what it is the writer's trying to convey to us as it relates to this portion of the topic within this context. And so we'll get back into chapter 8 here in just a moment, but before we go any further, if you would, let's bow our heads together and we will share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day. Thank you for the blessings that you continue to bestow upon us. We recognize that all good things come from you and that you care for us and watch over us on a daily basis. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for the promises found in him. Strengthen us in our faith and our convictions towards him as we strive to honor you. Father, thank you for this wisdom that you provide for us in this book of Ecclesiastes. Continue to strengthen us in our studies. Help us and encourage us to learn and glean the knowledge that you share with us and to appreciate how we can strengthen ourselves in your wisdom as we study this book. Strengthen us always, guide us and direct us, and we pray this through Christ's name. Amen. All right, so interestingly, again, and we make references to this and have throughout our study, we generally believe who wrote the book. Solomon. We generally believe that. And why I say we generally believe that, and I say we, I'm not trying to put you in a category, by the way, maybe you don't, but it's the general conclusion that Solomon wrote. Are there moments in the book that kind of point almost directly to him? Yes, right? There are things that happen in the book that he's almost exclusively the guy it could be talking about. Are there things in the book that go, that doesn't fit him? Yes, right? There are things in the book that you go, that's not, doesn't really fit him. And so it's hard sometimes. But if it be, and he's talking about rulers and how you address kings, and if it be him in his later years, he is probably already seeing the handwriting on the wall of what? Of the divided kingdom coming, right? He's seeing in his own children the division that is on the horizon. And remember that the nation only remained united through 3 kings, right? They were Saul, David, and Solomon, right? And if this is the end of Solomon's reign, that this book of Ecclesiastes is being written, then he's already seeing the complications and difficulties that have been going on, and maybe that's what's happening here as he writes these thoughts about how they ought to be addressing a king. But then he'll also talk about the fact that sometimes the kings don't make the right decisions and don't lead the people in the right ways. And remember that all kings eventually come and they go, right? And so I'm just trying to give you the umbrella so that when you think about these things that he shares with us here in this text, that it'll maybe help us to appreciate what he is trying to share with us. He reminds them, let's look quickly at the first few verses that we looked at Wednesday night. He says, "Who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God." And we talked briefly on Wednesday night about the fact that there were multiple oaths that had been made to the kings by the people, and how they were going to honor that. And we've learned in this book that all vows and oaths are actually made before whom? Before God, and all of them should be honored and respected. And so maybe he's just pointing back to that. And again, that was Wednesday night's conversation. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Be cautious, because the king basically rules from whose vantage point? His own, right? A king, right? A king has all authority and power. That's the concept of a king. He has no check and balance. There's no system in place to kind of govern that individual in order to keep them in a right way. They have all the power and all the authority. It can do whatever pleases them, whatever they want, they can do. Can you think of any references in the history? Now, this would have to be post Solomon, but can you think of things in their history that illustrate how kings just do whatever they want? Can you think of examples of where that happened even among the kings of Israel or Judah? Okay. He's the first that comes to my mind, right? Ahab comes to mind very quickly of a guy who just did whatever he wanted to do, including what? Ball's vineyard and the various things, right? A king does whatever pleases the king, and that's it. So be careful, because you don't want to be hasty in how you address the king, because it may not be to your advantage or benefit. And so there's caution here. Where the word of the king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, what doest thou? And that's kind of where we left Wednesday night that I wanted to come back to. So where the king is, there is power. And who can speak to the king and tell the king, no, you're going to do it this way, when the king has already decided this is the manner in which something is going to occur. And so the caution here, and again, I don't want to reiterate Wednesday's study, but the concepts are foreign to us here, right, in our governmental system. And I'm highly cautious right now, because I know the political climate that we live in right now. And I know the accusations, and I know the sides, and I know the differing opinions of lots of people, and I'm trying to be sensitive to all of that. But even if you believe we have people in position who act like a king, the truth is, at the moment, we don't have a king. We don't have a king, okay? We don't, all right? We have, there's still three branches of government. They're still functioning, right? So, and all I'm trying to get us to understand is the idea of full authoritative power with absolute no ability to keep that power in check is not really all that common to us. We are much more familiar with a system that has people who keep each other in some level of balance. Sometimes that system the scales maybe get tipped one way or the other by the people that are in positions of authority and power. But generally speaking, it is not a concept that we generally fully grasp, where somebody has such authoritative power that no matter what they say, it happens. And no matter what they do, it can happen. That's who he's talking about here. And I'm just trying to make sure we understand the kind of situation. So whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing. If you do what the king says, you'll generally stay out of trouble, right? That's the argument. If you do what the king says, you will generally stay out of trouble. And a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. Time and judgment as it relates to what? A wise man will understand time and judgment. Okay, so there's appropriate moments and inappropriate moments, or good moments and bad moments, to actually maybe address some issue. Who jumps to mind with that? Think about that for a minute. For such a time as That's Esther, right? That's Esther. If you remember Esther, Mordecai comes to Esther, and I'm giving you the real short version here, but Mordecai comes to Esther and says, listen, our people are suffering, and you're the only one who can do anything about it. You're the only one in the right time and position to be able to address this. She says, no, it's not the right time because the king hasn't summoned me in to have any conversation with him. And and then he argues, either you now or your people are going to continue to suffer, and your own family will suffer consequences. And she has to make the right judgment that this is the right time to go in and have a conversation with the king. I'm just trying to illustrate it to you. Sometimes you've got to discern. A wise man will discern what's the right moment. He'll use judgment in trying to decide how it is and when it is that he might approach a king. And all kings weren't unapproachable. Even foreign kings were approachable. Anybody remember who Nehemiah was? Cupbearer to whom? The king, right? And not a king over God. He's cupbearer to the king over. Okay, right? Is that right? Right. I'm asking, by the way. I'm trying to just jog all our memories here. So, which king was it? Anybody remember? Artaxerxes. Okay, there we go. So it's Artaxerxes, and he goes in and he says, listen, it's time for us to go back where? To go back home. He discerned time and judgment. It's time for us to return back to our homeland. And not only did he get the benefit of all the things that were necessary for the people, but he was given all kinds of benefits. Time and judgment. When do I approach a king and when do I not approach a king? How I do that. A wise man will discern those things. A foolish man will do what? Yeah, he'll do the opposite. He'll dive in with both feet and won't even think. He won't concern himself with the consequences. He won't concern himself with there's going to be any value in this moment. A foolish man just dives in with both feet and throws all caution and thought to the wind and creates greater challenges for himself if he does. If you keep the commandments, you won't feel an evil thing. By the way, is that principle restated anywhere that you can think of? That rule and authority is there to govern good and evil. So there's New Testament references, right, to this idea that government is there to protect the people and deal with evildoers. And if you do what is right, then you generally stay out of difficulty and harm's way. What's interesting about that, though, is that those are general principles that are generally true. Are they hard and fast? No, because in the very same time period those things were being taught, what were happening to many of the apostles? Yeah, they're being arrested. They're being arrested and thrown in jail for doing nothing but preaching the truth about Jesus. And so the writer here, and even the New Testament writers who encourage even some of Jesus' teachings, and we talked Wednesday night about Jesus showing some folks a coin, right? And he said, whose inscription is that? And they said, what? That's Caesar's. And so Jesus said, give Caesar what's Caesar's and give God what's God's. And showed that principle. So the caution here is time and judgment when you address a king. Remember, the king has all authority and power, and you can put yourself in pretty good jeopardy if you're not cautious in this. You might want to slow down a little bit, not be like the foolish ones that just kind of dive in and say things and create problems and difficulties for themselves that they could have avoided. And generally speaking, in Scripture, when are the only times that you ever really see any kind of reference to resisting authority? When it goes against God. I think every time you find an example in Scripture where people were resisting against authority, and it appears to be fitting in the mind of God that they do that, is when folks have to honor what God has told them to fulfill rather than man. In fact, some of the apostles will just say that, right? You decide whether we ought to obey God or man, but we're telling you we're going to obey God and we're going to do what is right. The only times we ever see a resistance against authority that is positively spoken of within Scripture are those moments when the authority has put me in conflict with what God would want from me. And in those moments, I have to choose God over any authority that might be governing me.
Even then, if you think about the stories throughout the Bible, especially if you're talking about the Israelites, look at the Judges. Israelites go, and God doesn't immediately address this. And a lot of times, He allows this to happen and waits for the right time to do it. So, I mean, you see this principle carried out even in God's actions at some level.
Yeah. And we parallel it.
Yeah.
And how He behaved. Any other thoughts about that? Yeah, we'll serve the Lord. And Josh was thought regardless. Because to every purpose, notice verse 6, there is time and judgment, therefore the misery of man is great upon him. Create greater challenges for yourself sometimes without using proper time and judgment. For he knoweth not that which shall be, for who can tell him when it shall be. The writer spends a lot of time reminding us that you don't always know what's coming around the next corner. Who's ultimately in charge of everything? God is. And again, I don't always know. Why did that guy gain power and authority? Why did this historic figure get such a control over certain aspects of things? How does all that? But at the end of the day, I've got to remind myself that there is but one authority that ultimately everybody answers to. And this book's trying to remind us of that. And that ultimate authority is God. And we don't always know the rhyme, the reason, the time, the judgments that God is using. We don't always understand those things, though we might desire to. And so sometimes it takes a level of patience. We spoke last Sunday night, about reminding us that where did evil come from? Yeah, the subtlety of Satan leads man to then do that which is evil. Evil exists because Satan tempts and man follows, right? And so when evil authorities and evil men come into power, good luck defining that anymore, by the way. But so that sounded political, didn't it? But because right, that's the world we live in. How it used to be, we were very quick and easy to say that's wrong. It's hard, much harder to right. It seemed so clearer before. That's wrong and this is right, but not so much anymore. But anyway, but be careful, because ultimately God, right? And I don't know, and God's timing may not be my timing of how He addresses certain things and the longevity of certain behaviors. But the Ecclesiastes writer is trying to encourage us. A wise man will let God be who He is. And sometimes you might have to survive some evil circumstances. I still think about, even New Testament times, Judea is being controlled by whom? Rome, right? It's being controlled by Rome. You see all these situations among the Jews, and Rome is, to a very small extent, allowing the Jews to kind of govern themselves from a religious standpoint. But when it comes to really any authoritative action, anything the Jews wanted to do, they had to go to Rome, right? They had to go to whatever authority to ask permission to be able to fulfill those things. And Rome didn't necessarily look kindly upon the Jews or Christians later. And the entire book of Revelation is really about encouraging those that John was writing to stand strong in the face of that oppression and challenge that was coming from authoritative figures. I think sometimes we shortchange the reasoning behind the book of Revelation, and we put it into application thousands and thousands of years later, and as if it had no meaning to the people it was actually being written to. But I think in Revelation 1, when you see these things must shortly come to pass, that should gauge everything we think about when we study that book. That's a different study, though. We'll do that another time. But anyway, we get the point. There is no man, verse 8, there is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, neither hath he power in the day of death. And there is no discharge in that war, neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. The king will eventually what? He's going to die, right? And it doesn't matter how powerful he is. It doesn't matter how much authority he wielded. It doesn't matter. None of that will be relevant. He will face the same demise. There is no man, whether he's a king or he's got nothing, whether he's a man of position of authority and power or he has no significance whatsoever in the grand scheme of men, no man hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. Eventually, death, separation occurs. He doesn't have power in the day of death. There is no discharge in that war, right? There's no escaping that separation that will ultimately become. Neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. That wickedness may have presided for a long period of time, even among kings that did not live and act and behave honorably towards God, but someday they also fall in the same fashion that every man falls. And it's interesting because, so think about their history from the time, again, if this is Solomon, into his life, right before the divided kingdom. We're going to have Judah and Israel. We're going to have Israel that really doesn't have, in terms of quality of kings, none, right? None. They're not going to have any that are very good. Judah, on the other hand, though, occasionally, right? And generally, they find themselves kind of returning back to God when? Yeah, and the good king has to come when the bad one dies. Right? When the bad king dies, then the next king comes along, right? The new king with maybe some wiser counsel around them or whatever happens. The new king comes along. The bad king had no ability to overcome death, had no ability to win that battle over. A new king takes over, and maybe a restoration towards God can now occur. They had to go through a period of times where things weren't great. But that king dies, new king takes his place. That king may soon be forgotten, the bad one, and better things come on the horizon. That's just general imagery that the writer of Ecclesiastes is illustrating.
It's interesting. Comparing the kings to the judges were appointed by God. So you would know that the judges, are doing what they're supposed to be doing, what, God said, because they were appointed by God. When it came to a king, you didn't know what you were going to get. The next king may have been, may have a restoration period, towards God. But we saw in the history of Israel and Judah that didn't always happen. There would be multiple kings in a row. You know, that the chart that, you know, little kids would have with the smiley face kings or the frowny face kings, whether they were good or bad. You'd see the lineage of Israel, and you'd see there were multiple of those bad kings in a row. So you never knew exactly what you were going to get. But the judge, at least you knew it was appointed by God, so you knew they had instructions to follow God.
And even the kings had instructions, they just ignored them on so many of occasions as it relates to those things. But and maybe, again, it's so hard, right? Because if this is hard and fast Solomon in his older years, maybe he's warning them about what's about to come, right? He's telling them, listen, you're gonna have periods of time where good kings are going to be in place. And you're got periods of times where evil and bad kings are in place. And a wise man will handle it this way. Foolish men will handle it in foolish ways. But if you want to be a wise man, when you see these cyclical things happening, be cautious and be patient and allow God's timing of events to continue to work. All this have I seen, he said in verse 9, and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. I've seen it. I've witnessed it. And here's the struggle, right? So if this is Solomon, he either witnessed it where? Okay, so he either had to witness it in his father, David, right? And maybe that could be. Maybe he all this have I seen and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. Maybe he sees that in David. Maybe he sees it in himself, right? Maybe this is very personal to him because he as an older man reflecting back on his authoritative reign, maybe he has what we would call regrets, right? Maybe he looks back and he thinks about things that he could have done very differently, and his decision making became the source of his own harm and hurt, the text says. And so maybe he sees it in earlier kings, maybe he saw it himself, maybe he sees it in the kings of the nations round about him. But if this be Solomon, there are multiple sources by which he could have seen this. And the end conclusion he makes is they make these horrible decisions and don't rule very well to their own hurt. They don't recognize they're creating problems for themselves at the end of it all, until maybe it's too late. All right, I'll pause. Any thoughts about that segment? Because that kind of breaks down that paragraph about these authoritative kings and all this messaging that the writer brings.
Possibly too on that last thing. I know it wouldn't be Moses in that era or anything, but when Moses went out and he saw the Israelites, two of them fighting against each other, and he sees one kill the other one. One is ruling over the other one in that respect too.
Yeah. And I think generally speaking, right, sometimes the principle of ruling over another that creates harm is something that permeates just about every scenario that we can see in some of those ways. Okay, so let's move to the next section then. So, I don't want to be flippant or overly trivial here, but basically you're going to have some bad people in authority. Deal with it. That's kind of what the writer said, right? You're going to have to live with that. I've seen it. The writer says, I've seen it. It's happened. You're going to have to be smart about how you address it, time and judgment, all of that, right? All those things we talk about. It's just a reality. But through it all, I've got to fear God, right? Through all of that, my main thought process is to stay focused upon the one entity that I always have to fear and respect. So I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This is also vanity. I saw some pretty wicked people do some bad things. They ultimately died, were buried. Even people that were where, he said? From the place of the holy. Even those who were authoritative in religious matters didn't necessarily always honor what God wanted, and they were buried, and in time, forgotten. This is also part of this vanity, he said, that he's been speaking about throughout the book. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. So it seems to me, he says, so we watched wickedness happen. That wicked man dies and he's buried. And men quickly forget the conflicts and challenges that the wicked brought, and they soon go right into the very same things again. And one of the reasons that he says that happens is why? Why do people go back to the same evil? Why do people continue to do evil things? According to verse 11. Okay, because the heart, sons of men, is determined they're going to do evil. And there's something said right before that, though. Yeah, because judgment doesn't happen fast. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore, the result of that is the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Bad behaviors left alone eventually just continue to foster further bad behaviors. And the longer you put off addressing those things, the easier it is for more and more people to fall prey to those bad behaviors. And so he says, listen, the unfortunate problem with this is that wickedness and evil isn't always addressed with the expediency we would like. It doesn't always happen fast. And because of that, men are tempted to think, well, nothing bad really happened. Why not keep doing it? Or why not involve myself in those behaviors? And so lesson number one might be very, in the immediate sense is, we are wise to try to address things as quickly as possible, right? If we want to stop a progression of sinful, evil behaviors, the best way to do that would be to address it as quickly as possible. But that's not even a reality when it comes to a man in position of authority as a king. So if I can't stop it immediately, then the next best thing I can do is make sure I don't repeat it. But because it doesn't always happen quickly, he says, I'm trying to talk in circles here with you, but that's what the writer's saying. People go right back to it because the judgment didn't happen immediately.
We see that from a very early age too. So children as young as, to me, 6 months to a year can develop these habits. If you don't stop that or nip it in the bud, if you will, it's going to continue. And then we see 7-year-olds becoming more and more aggressive in their behavior, or they're just not listening, and it's getting harder to control them. And then parents turn around 10 years later and they're like, I don't understand why they did ABC. Well, you all along, you haven't been taking care of the problem immediately.
It was never addressed.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it becomes a bigger problem later. And that happens. And ultimately, the writer's going to push us back towards, though we witness this happening, evil perpetuating itself, don't forget, though, to fear God irregardless of what you might witness. And that's verse 12, and that's where we'll come back, Lord willing, on Wednesday.